Hey, everybody, it's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano, and I'm happy to have you with me. Of course, if you ever miss the Plant-Based Business Hour, just go ahead and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You should go ahead and do that now, actually, so you never miss a Plant-Based Business Hour podcast. And of course, always please leave a 5-star review. It certainly does help. So you know that on this show, we talk about the shifting food supply system. Quite a lot, actually. But when are we actually going to shift, and what's that going to look like? Today, we're going to get into the details. I want to bring on my guest, prolific investor and prolific author, Jim Mellon, joining me from the Isle of Man, I believe. Is that right, Jim?
That's right, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for having me. The Isle of Man is probably unknown to most of your listeners stroke viewers, but it's a small island in between Ireland and the United Kingdom. And that's where I am at the moment. And the weather is sublime.
Yeah, I hear it's absolutely beautiful. I've never been, so it's on my list of things to do. So you are such a kind and jovial person that I hate to do this, but I think I have to start out our interview a tad bit rudely. I want to tell everyone that you are a billionaire. Now, usually I don't start a conversation talking about the size of someone's wallet, which seems so incredibly rude, but I mention it here because it's very germane to our discussion. So as I said before, we're going to be talking about the shifting food supply system and why I want to get your vision, not just because you wrote a book that's out now that I recommend to everyone. We're going to talk about it the whole show. Moore's Law, The Investor's Guide to the New Agrarian Revolution. You wrote this book, but also you've been a prolific investor your entire life, hence the billionaire status. And that's relevant because you've made some gutsy moves and you've been on the right side, the winning side more than not. So your status as a billionaire is very relevant here. And so I'm looking forward to your perspective about how the food supply system is going to change and when exactly. So let me just set it up a little bit for my listeners, and then I'm handing you the mic and you can run away with it. So everybody on the Plant-Based Business Hour, you know about plant-based foods, and you also know about fermented proteins. So last week we had Arturo Elizondo from Clara Foods. He was here talking about fermenting yeast and getting protein from that. We've had Ryan Pandya, Perfect Day, talking about taking genes and basically, I'm oversimplifying, graphing them onto microbes and fermenting just like you would beer, adding some fat and sugar, getting ice cream. So we know about that. And then we have cellular meat and cultivated meat, as we also like to call it. So I want to start there. Of the 3 pillars, you're betting heavy on cellular meat. Why is that?
That is a great question. So basically, we're not so much betting heavily on cellular meat, but cellular forms of agriculture, which include meat, seafood, I would say dairy in the form of precision fermentation. You mentioned Perfect Day, which I think is an outstanding company, by the way.
I had it last night.
And really outstanding. And I interviewed them for my book, as I did with Clara, which also I think is a great company. And also materials, Elizabeth. So things like leather grown in labs, threads, cotton, collagen, and so forth. So we're looking at a market that is enormous. Yes. You are in the world's biggest economy. That your economy is worth about $20 trillion a year. I know numbers these days are just crazy, but it's about a quarter the size of the US economy. It's bigger than, for instance, electric vehicles will ever be. And it's something that we need to do every day. And we need to do this thing every day, which is to eat. And so what we're doing, what you and other mission-aligned people like yourself are doing, is talking about a complete upending of the way in which we eat proteins, in which we make materials, in which we drink milk-based products. And it's going to happen very, very soon. And I'll be happy to tell you when I think it's going to happen if you want me to.
I sure do. Yes. And I want to add to what you're saying, just for the benefit of my listeners. And when you say that we're shifting our materials, what we eat, what we drink, What we're also going to perhaps talk about later in the show is we're shifting how we farm. So if you're going to shift that big chunk of the food supply system, you have to shift the machineries that make those, or the machinery that, farms. Let's say if you're no longer going to do monocrop farming, et cetera, you need new machinery for that, bioreactors that we have to build for cellular agriculture. So from top to bottom, you're going to see a complete shift. But I would love to hear when you think it's going to shift.
Okay, so basically I got into this because I've been involved in the biotech industry for quite a while. And we've created a number of biotech companies, 2 of which are actually listed in the US markets. And the cell ag process comes out of the biotech industry. So the reason why it all started so expensively is because biotech companies don't really care about what their input costs are, because their output costs are so high. But obviously in food, you can't charge biotech prices for someone's daily consumption. So what we've been looking at is ways in which the biotech process can be made cheaper in order to enable the food in the first instance to get down to what I call griddle parity. Grid parity is a word used in the electricity industry to describe when the price of renewable energy like wind or solar gets down to the price equivalence of fossil fuel generated energy. And I'm using the same thing, griddle parity, as a means of describing when the price of plant-based or cell ag-based foods gets down to the price of conventionally intensively farmed foods. And now here's my prediction, all right? And
yes,
the more I get into this, and I'm really excited about this industry and all it's going to do for us as humans, for the planet, and motivationally for me, for animals, is that in 10 years' time, we will not have the dairy industry as we currently know it. There won't be, at least on any significant scale, cows producing milk, which goes into cheeses, yogurts, etc. This will all be replaced by plant-based milks, which are already taking up a big share of the market, or by precision fermentation, which gets back to, of course, our Perfect Day company that we were talking about earlier on. Not our company, because it's not my company, but it's a brilliant company. And then in terms of meat, I'm going to make the prediction, which is not an absurd prediction, that 50%, 50%, of all meat eaten by humans on the planet will either be plant-based or cell ag produced within 10 years. And then lastly, on seafood, which is not insignificant, it's a very big market, I predict that more than half of seafood will be produced in what they call cell aquaculture within 10 years. So we are on the cusp.
Oh my God.
We're in the very early stage. I like to call it the dial-up phase of the internet stage of an industry that's going to completely blow away. And you are so right, Elysabeth. The way in which farms operate, the way in which animals are treated,
yes,
the way in which animals are pumped full of harmful substances for us as humans, like antibiotics and hormones, and the way in which we consume foods that are ultimately harmful for us and the planet. This is happening now. This is not science fiction. Every company we've invested in, and we are now the biggest investors in the world in this cell ag space, has a product. It's not like an idea that we're going to do something. This is here and now. And this is why what you do and every one of the other key advocates in this industry does is so important. Think of the millions of pigs, millions of chickens, millions of cows, millions of dumb in the view of the world, but not dumb in their own view or in the way in which we should regard them, animals who are killed on a daily basis so that we can eat in a primitive fashion. This has got to stop.
Well, thank you for saying all of that. Yes, we eat in a way that is bad for our health. We eat in a way that is bad for the environment, not just because it's wildly wasteful. So here I'm speaking to a premier businessman. So we talk about this on the show, the inefficiency of animal agriculture. So we cut down trees. Oh, hey, now wait a minute. We need those trees because they pull carbon from the air and we have a climate crisis. Okay, but we decide not to do that. We cut them down. We grow grains. Do we give those grains that have protein and fiber to people? No, we give them to animals. And then, of course, animals need time. They need water. They need land. Tick tock, tick tock. Do we have any meat yet? No, we have to cut down more trees, grow more grains. Are we giving those grains to people? No, we're still not. We're giving them to animals. Wildly inefficient business equations. The World Resources says it takes 9 calories of feeding a chicken to get 1 calorie back. That's the best equation you will ever see. It's something like 35-1 for a cow. That means a business person might say, hey, I'll give you $3.50. You give me a dime back. Nobody wants that equation. It's one of the good things that I think that will help shift the industry very quickly. It's not just that what we want to see change for animals, we want to see change for the planet. So do businesses. Businesses are pushing this as well, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it's going to go so quickly. But I want your opinion on that. 10 years' time is around the corner. So what is going to be the thing, the little click that makes it all fall like dominoes?
A very good question. So if we remember back, I think it was 12 or 13 years ago, the first iPhone came out. It's a blink of an eye, isn't it?
Yes.
And now, here we are. All of us have one. Or
slave.
Or equivalent. Yeah. Yes. Well, you're right. We're slaves to it. But the technology adoption can be incredibly fast. Yes. And so just because I make a prediction that's relatively close to the future doesn't mean it's going to happen. And it has to happen because we are living in a world of climate change emergency. We know that with COP26 coming up in my own country. I'm Scots born, by the way, Elizabeth, 100%.
Beautiful.
In Glasgow in 2021. So this year in November, all the leaders of the world are going to converge in my dad's hometown to discuss this looming, it's not even creeping, it's a looming emergency, and we need to do something about it. And one of the key factors in that is intensive farming. It depends, who you read, who's telling the story, but my convinced view is that about 1/5 of all global emissions come from agriculture as it currently exists, and most of that comes from intensive farming of the poor animals that we described earlier on. And we know that 80 billion animals are killed every year for our personal or human consumption. It's disgusting, actually. And then 2 trillion fish are killed every year as well. I don't know. I mean, I haven't eaten meat for a long, long time, but I look back with, we all have shameful moments in our past, all of us. And now one of my great shames is I ever was eating meat. We have to stop it.
Mm-hmm. I love that you say, and with the conviction that you say it, I'll be a little mouse to this conversation and follow up on some of the things you're saying. So when you say that 20% of the emissions come from the system of animal farming, that's more than all of transportation put together, planes, trains, automobiles, et cetera. So we're talking about vast numbers, and it is from your book, Moore's Law, the Investor's Guide to the New Agrarian Revolution, that I knew that Americans on average eat between 180 and 220 pounds of meat, which is a lot of meat because I'm not eating any meat. So that means somebody else is an average. So somebody else is eating 300 pounds of meat a year. It's sort of staggering. But I also read in your book, quoting Jonathan Safran Foer, that Americans eat in their lifetime 21,000 entire animals. And I'm still wrapping my mind around that number. I think it must be because shrimp probably counts as one animal. And I'm not sure, but it's a staggering number.
Well, I mean, the largest number of animals that are eaten, aside from fish, are chickens.
Yes.
And, the chickens are the ones that constitute most of that number. But it is absolutely shameful, whatever way you look at it. And of course, it's not good for you. I mean, we know that eating animal meats all the time leads to disease and premature death. And I just want to give you an example, if I may, Elizabeth. As I mentioned, my dad was born in Glasgow in Scotland. I was born in Edinburgh. And in Glasgow, which is an interesting city. It's about, I think, about 2 million people. You have, within a 10-kilometer or a 6-mile radius, a 30 year life expectancy differential between the people who live in the rich area and the people who live in the poor area. And you might say that's due, or not you obviously, but someone might say, well, that's due to them drinking too much or smoking or not exercising, all the stuff that you read about in the news. But actually it's not. It's due to the people in the poor areas eating processed meat, which is sausages, pasties. I don't think you have pasties in the US, but salami, that sort of highly processed meat, full of nitrites, full of bad stuff. That is the principal reason that you have a 30-year life expectancy gap in that one reasonably affluent city by world standards. So, it's not just about the environment. It's not just about the fact that by feeding 80% of the world's antibiotics to farmed animals, we're creating a pandemic risk that could be even greater than the one that unfortunately we're going through at the moment. It's about human health. Eat processed meats and you die younger. Simple as that.
Mm-hmm. And that's been well established by the World Health Organization, that does put processed meat as a class 1 carcinogen, up there with cigarettes. Not hyperbole at all that eating carcinogen meat, I'll call it processed meat, gives you about a 16% chance more of cancer, akin to secondhand smoke. So that has been well documented. And, here we talk about the big three, I'll say: animal welfare, our health, and the health of the planet. But then there's all the other reasons as well. So we, of course, have a pandemic and we're living through that. So this connection that here we've been told to social distance. That's all people can talk about during the pandemic. Social distance, social distance. There's about 7.7 billion people on the planet. We farm 80 billion, per your conversation that you just said, animals a year. They're not social distancing. We intentionally put them butt to snout, literally living on top of each other in their own feces. We have forced them to do this. That means 90% of the planet isn't social distancing. You'll never outrun a pandemic when you've got numbers like that. So pandemics, but also, the chemical runoffs from just think of all the manure that is put out of a pig farm, and that's not treated. That's just kind of put right back into the water supply, along with the chemicals and the antibiotics and the hormones. And so, these are these ripple effects that we have in our communities, and those communities that live around factory farms. Those people suffer to a greater degree of post-traumatic stress syndrome from working in the factories, and also chemicals that are affected in their water, et cetera. So, obviously, as you say, we must change this now. So back to business. To change it, we have to bring the costs down, as you say, griddle parity. So you're very keen on cellular agriculture, and I do want to get into why that versus plant-based. And I know you're keen on both, but you're really sort of betting hard on cellular agriculture. The problem there is the media. So what the cells feed on is very expensive. And I don't 100% understand why, because it's amino acids and hormones and sugar, but it is extremely expensive. How is that cost going to come down so that the end cost of cellular meat can come down?
Yeah, well, brilliant point. So the reason my book is called Moore's Law is that an American person called Gordon Moore, about 50 years ago, who was the co-founder of Intel, which, as you know, is one of the world's biggest semiconductor manufacturers, invented this thing called Moore's Law. And Moore's Law suggested that the price of semiconductors would come down by half every 18 months, and the efficiency would double every 18 months. And that, believe it or not, has held steady all the way up till now. So that's why we have chips today for a refrigerator that can do more computing than all of the NASA computers did when man went to the moon in the 1960s. So what I wanted to get across was that Moore's Law, obviously a riff off the cow, was equivalent to this, and that ultimately the price of cell ag products in particular would come down below the level of conventionally farmed, intensively farmed animals.
Yes.
And we're on the way. We're on the
Yeah.
way. In 2013, the first Sellag burger was produced, and it was unveiled in London by Professor Mark Post, who's now the head of science at Mosa Meats, which is a Dutch company that we like. And it was about $300,000 for the first patty that he produced. Today it's less than $9, and so Moore's Law is very much alive. So yes, you are right. The price of all the key components, and bear in mind we're getting back to the fact that it's a biotech process, needs to come down. But we can see that every day. We can see the media price coming down. We can see that alternative medias are being developed. We can see that growth factors, which were originally absolutely non-vegan because they were called fetal bovine serum, are now gone. No company that we know of is using FBS.
I'm so happy.
Which is disgusting, by the way. And we can see that the price of bioreactors, which were formerly made, and by the way, bioreactors, for those who don't know, are large stainless steel tubes, basically, in which the process of amplifying the cells, which then go on to make the meat or the products, are produced. The bioreactor companies are now scaling up, and the price of those bioreactors are coming down. So at scale, you rightly point out that chickens are very inefficient, but the most efficient of all animals at processing plant-based proteins into animal proteins. It's about 9 to 1. Cows, somewhere between 25 and 35 to 1. And all sorts of forests are dumped in order to make way for soybean production, which largely goes into animals. It's 70% of all world crops that are grown go into animals. Very inefficient producers. So what could the Sellag business do in relation to that? Well, we've estimated that at scale, and that's in about 10 years' time, the inputs will be 2.5 to 1. So compare that to a chicken, which is 9 to 1, and compare that to a cow, which, as you rightly point out, is 25 to 35 to 1. And you can see where the price is going. And by the way, the meat that comes out is the best in species. It doesn't have contaminants that are going to make you sick. It doesn't have antibiotics. It doesn't have any waste, like the entrails, like the tail, like the
hooves or ears or
all that sort of stuff. And so why wouldn't you, as a business person or as a human being or as a planet lover, want to promote that industry, which is why I'm doing it. And, it's a commercial enterprise, but the number one priority is let's lessen animal suffering. Yes. Let's change the planet. Let's accelerate the move towards changing the way in which we consume food, which is all the stuff that you talk about day in, day night. And some of that is going to happen with plants, which is fantastic. And some of that will happen with Sellag. And the reason I prefer Sellag, from a business point of view, this is not to do with the fundamentals, but from a business point of view, is that you and I, Elysabeth, could start a plant-based company tomorrow, and we could call it Elysabeth and Jim's Natural Kitchen, all right?
Okay.
But because we don't need a lot of intellectual property to do that. We could just make up our own recipe, and then it comes down to, you obviously have a very good way of selling things, but it's our marketing skills and our production skills and our ability to place it in supermarkets. But in Sellag, there's much more what I call intellectual property, which is patents, ways in which you can protect your IP, generating greater value for investors, at least for a short period of time, about 10 years. But that means that from an investor's point of view, I kind of prefer the Sellag stuff. It doesn't mean that I don't applaud every element of trying to get rid of animals in the food supply chain.
So much to unpack there, and so much to talk about. I will come back to the funding of research and government's role here, and the issues that we haven't talked about, like national security, due to food and water. Basically, those are going to be the things that people fight about, land and water. And as we saw during COVID, pandemics do two things. They disrupt labor supplies, job markets, and they disrupt food supplies. We're going to get back to that. Hold on to that. I'd like to talk a little bit about what you're saying for cellular meat. So cellular meat, another benefit to it, in addition to the IP, which is so great, is that you really don't have to ask people to change. If you liked eating chicken before, you get to eat chicken now, except there's that concept that it came from a lab. How do you see people adopting to cellular meat? And do you have any thoughts? We talked a tad bit about marketing. Do you have any thoughts about how best to communicate it to the consumer?
Yeah, that's, an A1 point. So basically, many of the companies have done their focus groups and studies and so forth with high levels of consumer acceptance implied, but it hasn't really been tested. And as you know, Eat Just has got its product on in Singapore. We think that Blue Nalu will have its fish product in the United States by the end of this year. Yeah. The leather is already out there because anything you can't eat, well, it doesn't need a regulatory pathway. But it's going to be interesting as to how that pans out. Now, I would just point out that at the turn of the last century, pasteurized milk was a big controversy, all right? And unpasteurized milk was the way that all the milk producers, the government of the United States, etc., wanted the milk to be produced. But thousands of people were dying every year because of the lack of pasteurization of milk. And so it took a little bit of time, but not very much time, for the consumers to say, we want pasteurized milk. And pasteurized, by the way, means heating it up very quickly to 130 degrees Celsius and then bringing it back down and getting rid of all the bugs that are in the milk if it comes straight out of the cow. And it became mandatory. The federal government mandated it as a result of consumer pressure that milk became pasteurized. And as a result, thousands and thousands and thousands, probably millions altogether, of lives were saved. So the consumer pushed that. And I think you mentioned earlier on that consumers will want this stuff. Now, in the first instance, what are they going to want? Well, most meat in the United States, that's 60% of all meat, is eaten in the form of ground meat. So it's in a burger or it's in a nugget or something like that. That, I think, is much easier to sell to consumers because, honestly, they don't see it. It's unstructured, it's easier to produce, it's cheaper to produce, etc. And that's the market that we're really interested in, is the unstructured meat market to begin with, along with fish. And everyone in the United States, I guarantee everyone in the United States knows that fish is something you should avoid eating too often because of the mercury, the microplastics, the toxins, the antibiotics, the way in which Seaspiracy was, sensationalist, but very, very good. The way in which the fish is produced and the absolutely appalling way in which bycatch is used and all that sort of stuff. And so I think fish is going to have a relatively easy pathway. But let's make no mistake about it. In the US, unlike anywhere else really, you have a very powerful lobby on behalf of beef farmers. Yeah. And possibly chicken farmers, but basically beef. And they're going to fight all the way, and they're trying to fight all the time to stop what we're doing, what you and I and others are doing. And we have to mobilize to present the argument that this is not Frankenfoods. Right. This is not GM food. This is not modified in any way. This is basically the same food, but produced without the animal. And, that argument is going to take some time to make, but I can see that more and more people are getting involved in this. And we can see it from the sales, right? You can see it from the sales of plant-based foods. And I think we'll see it from the sales of cultured meat foods as well. We're very close to a tipping point. And the best way of looking at it is look at what happened to milk. 10 years ago, you walked into Starbucks, you had a latte, it was milk. Today, Oatly's gone public at a $10 billion valuation in the United States. Everyone knows about soya, almond, oat milk, etc. And nearly a quarter of the market by the end of next year will be or plant alternative milks. And that's before we get precision fermentation, which is an exact replica of what you know as milk today, but with no cows involved. That's why I say the dairy industry is finished. If I was in the dairy farm industry, I'd get out of it right now.
Amen. Preach into the choir here. Again, so much to unpack. Let me see if I can go back and nibble on some of what you're saying, which is so good. Ultimately, markets like efficiency. Consumers want what's best for them. And I think the argument is pretty easy to make that this is what's best for them. After just having lived through a pandemic, you can see protecting your food so that it is healthier, cleaner, doesn't have antibiotics and hormones, but also doesn't have, Ebola, these kind of things that can come from factory farming situations that can produce pandemics. I wonder what your opinion here is on meat and dairy hopping on this train. Large meat companies like, let's say, Tyson Ventures, their investment arm of Tyson Foods, getting on this train. What's valuable for me to have them around is I get their distribution channels and I also get their advertising budgets. And I'm really looking for the ad campaign once these folks are invested in plant-based and cell-based because they see it's going to make more money because it's more efficient. Well, then they've got an iron in the fire, and you're going to see these ad campaigns that say, look how manly it is to eat plants. So I wonder how you feel about meat and dairy potentially getting in and investing or buying up these companies.
Yeah, well, that's first of all, dairy is gone.
Yeah,
so
that's great.
You see, Borden and Dean Foods have gone bust in the United States.
Bankrupt,
so they're finished. There are big dairy conglomerates like Danone in France, for instance, and I imagine they're going to start switching their means of production. So we're looking at two types of company. One is the agnostic company that basically sells food as long as it's nutritious, is acceptable, and not even nutritious, but as long as it's legal and consumers will buy it, they'll do it. And as you probably saw, Nestle yesterday announced that I think it was 2/3 of all its food are deemed to be bad for, well, not good for you, let's put it like that. And so these big conglomerates will do whatever suits their budgets and whatever consumers want. And I think they are the ones most likely to end up distributing this sort of stuff. Now, Tyson, JBS, Cargill, the big producers of Purdue, of meat in the United States and in Brazil, they may put some money into some of these companies, but ultimately, if these companies succeed, it's going to completely disrupt their business model. And they've got, vast farms, vast investments in intensive farming. So to my mind, I can't see how they can make an investment in this and then just give up their existing businesses. So I regard them as somewhat suspect. I think that's the best way of putting it in terms of what they might do for us. And they in some cases they've dipped their toe into some of this stuff, but we need to be very, very careful about their motives and their ultimate aspirations. And so I think the big food companies, which are Unilever, Nestle, Kellogg, which don't actually produce animals, are probably the ones that are best suited to leading the adoption of this mass, what is going to be a mass movement. And there are three waves. The first wave is the plant one. The second wave is the cell ag one. And alongside it is the picks and shovels, the stuff that makes it all happen, the makers of media, the makers of growth hormones, the makers of bioreactors, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the three massive waves that I see coming. There'll be no shortage of money coming into this, Elizabeth. I mean, last year, I think about $1.2 billion came into it. This year, it'll be well over $3 billion. Next year, it could be $10 billion. This is the cell ag I'm talking about. There'll be huge amounts of money coming into it.
I hadn't realized that there was that much money in Sellag. Somehow I thought last year was like 330 million, which is going to seem like a small number to you. And this year already was 337. Oh, do I have that wrong?
I mean, it all depends how you measure it, but we look at it very, very closely. So we currently have, by the end of July, we'll have about $550 million in this field ourselves. So
Oh,
we're only one
well,
of the
yeah,
investors. So you
okay
can see
then.
that already
Whoops.
it's much bigger than people think. Yeah. And, you know, companies like Eat Justice raised $170 million for its subsidiary doing the Sellag stuff. Upside, which used to be called Memphis Meats, we don't know exactly how much they've raised, but it's a fair amount. Blue Nalu has raised just around $100 million in the last year. Geltor raised 90 something million dollars. It all adds up. So actually the figures are bigger than most people think.
Oh, that's just wonderful news. So you think there's enough money in this space to do it without big meat getting involved?
It depends what you, well, big meat is a good way of describing it. Yes, I do. I think that the big food companies, which are agnostic to meat, however, will, and you know, Kellogg's has got its own line now. Most of the supermarkets have their own line.
Yes.
Most of those companies will, I can see it in the UK. I don't know if you know that the UK is the biggest vegan and vegetarian food market in Europe.
Yeah.
And we are strong in plants. We have corn, which I think was the earliest of the big companies. And then we've got meatless farms here in the UK as well.
Sure.
And then, of course, you've got Impossible and Beyond.
Yeah.
If you go into a supermarket here in the UK, there's plenty of shelf space for those products now. Yeah. And in our household here, you can see behind me, we eat Beyond quite regularly. You know, it's when I spoke to Ethan Brown, founder of Beyond, we were just about to have the Beyond burgers, and I took a picture of the Beyond burgers and our dogs there who were looking at them with great joy and anticipation. So he was very happy about that.
Fun little tidbit. So Ethan Brown, when I interviewed him in my kitchen, he launched the Beyond Meat sausage in my kitchen, which is really fun.
Wow,
and he was
amazing.
It was really fun. It was before the press party and before it launched in Chicago, which is the sausage capital of the world, and was during a certain time. So it was before he went to market. I was the first interview that he did about the sausages, and he was dedicated to making them himself. So he wouldn't let me he said, no, I'll do it. So I've got all these pictures of Ethan at my stove, you know, making the sausage, heating up. Yeah, it was very, very fun. Obviously, he's a wealth of knowledge and a beautiful person. Okay.
He is.
Yes, just a beautiful individual. So, and wickedly smart. Okay, but I want to get back to this idea of, okay, so there will be a shakeout of all the players in the field. And so some will be bought up, some will fall apart, and some will make it to IPO, which is so very exciting. As you said, there's a lot of money coming into the space. And since COVID, it seems that people are finally getting the message, including investors. And you're seeing investor money pour in. And you're also seeing the company valuations just go like crazy, freaky numbers we're talking about. So I'm curious, sort of some of the details when you choose to invest. How are you valuing? You've got IP, which does help you with valuations. But how do you value these companies then when they're at such a nebulous stage?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And one of the reasons we pursue a portfolio approach is that some of them, as you rightly point out, will succeed, and I call them the bold ones. They'll go forward with their own marketing, their own IPOs, and all that sort of stuff. Some of them will be sold, and I think the majority of them will be sold to bigger companies. And then some will fold. It's the nature of capitalism and business. We evaluate them based on the strength of management, number one. You know, how competent and how credible is the management and their business plan. Number two, the strength of their IP, their intellectual property. Number three, the area in which they've chosen to go. So we're not really interested in companies that are doing a niche market. So, you know, there's a company in the UK trying to do caviar. There's one in Australia doing kangaroo meat. Yeah. There's one in Russia doing fur. There's a couple doing foie gras. We're not interested in those. We're interested in the low-hanging fruit, the big markets. And we're interested in, and I think finally, in the way in which they've executed. So if I had to tell you what the best companies are, they're not necessarily ones we've invested in, but I would say that Memphis, we're now known as Upside, is a very good company. Meatable and Mosa out of Holland are very good companies. We like Vitro Labs out of the United States. And by the way, I just want to say that the US, as in so many things, is the absolute clear world leader in this. We like Blue Nalu out of San Diego for its fish. We think that Eat Just is a very interesting story, and I think it will be one of the first ones to go public.
Oh, you do?
Along probably with Upside and Blue Nalu in the United States. I don't have any inside knowledge. I don't know, but that's my general guess. And then there are companies that are growing up in Israel, as an example, which are really interesting as well, like Aleph, Super Meats, etc. And all of those, you could talk to the founders all day long. And for writing this book, I interviewed really more or less everyone who'd founded a company in the field that we liked. And they all have the same motivation, which is the motivation that gets you up in the morning, and motivation that gets me up in the morning. But they all rightly point out that that motivation isn't enough. We need to get consumers to accept that the price, the taste, the texture, the convenience of this food is similar to what they're used to.
Yes, and nothing GFI. You've also interviewed Bruce Friedrich. They'll say it all the time. It's hard not to love Bruce. You've got to have taste, price, and convenience. You can't just be mission aligned. You've got to actually make a great product. And all of them are so dedicated. I will say, I've interviewed most of the same people that you've interviewed. And one on my list was Seth Tibbett, who's the founder of Tofurky. And he always says, that passion that we all have, that mission alignment is really a superhero power, because it drives you in a way that other business people aren't driven. And it's that extra boost usually to get you over the line. But ultimately, you do have to have a great product, and it's got to be there on taste, price, and convenience. I have not tried any cellular meat products. Have you?
Well, that's a very good point. And the answer is no. And the reason is because as all these companies went into their tasting protocols, we were stopped from traveling to your lovely country.
Yeah.
And we are still not allowed to come to the United States, believe it or not, even though we have in fact, there was 0 deaths from COVID in the UK today, the first time since the pandemic began.
Wow.
And I think we're more highly vaccinated than almost anywhere in the world. So it's annoying, but I want to get to the US because most of the tastings occur in the US. And I certainly want to take photographs of or someone will take photographs of me eating the stuff, because
history.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
I can't wait. But we're looking at white space opportunities as well, at areas in which we can start. My biotech background is starting with my brilliant partners, companies that are looking at untapped, unmet markets, and so we're doing that at the moment as well.
Within the food space?
Yes.
So what are the white spaces that you see within the food space?
I can't tell you, because otherwise they wouldn't be white for very long. So
this is an off-the-record conversation you and I will have later.
You'll be the first to know, and we're very close to doing that.
Okay.
And so this is occupying a lot. I mean, I thought I would be playing golf. Not that I play golf, but theoretically playing golf by now. But I'm still out there, and I really believe in this. And we have. I know this sounds a bit hokey, but we have 4 dogs. We love them very, very much, and but why wouldn't cows and chickens and all the other animals in the world get equal treatments to dogs? I don't understand it.
Oh my gosh, pigs are smarter than dogs. Chickens
not our dogs.
Okay, right. Sorry, not your family members. Of course, your children are the most beautiful of all children on the planet. But chickens can remember up to 100 animal and people faces. Just to show chickens that we discard with a disgusting irreverence as if they were objects can, they communicate. Obviously, they have families and they communicate, and there's that sense of community, but they can recognize and remember each other. It's just, has to change right now. And I'll say a motivating thing for me, obviously we're mission aligned for animals and people and the planet, but it has to happen in my lifetime. This isn't change I want to like see from whatever the grave. This is change that is happening in my lifetime, which is why I'm thrilled that you say we're pinpointing it to 10 years. And that's the first time, with the exception of the late Greg Stelton-Pohl, who's the co-founder, former CEO of Califia Farms, who did tell me that in 10 years, he thought plant-based dairy would be 50% of the market. And this was 6 months ago. You're already saying that dairy's just done in 10 years, which is beautiful in and of itself. But anyway, in our lifetime, Jim, in our lifetime.
I 100% agree, Elizabeth. As I mentioned, the iPhone example, but new technologies are getting adopted faster and faster and faster. And it's partly because of the internet, which we talked about, that people can see it all around the world, the opportunities, partly because, frankly speaking, of a better and more sentient world, in many ways, not in every way, but in some ways, and partly because, intensive farming didn't really exist until 1940, and now it's 99% in the US and 90% in Europe. And people can see that you can't buy a chicken in our major supermarket chain, which is called Tesco, or I'm sure it's the same in the US in Kroger or in Walmart or whatever, for $3 without something going wrong along the way.
Again, so much to unpack there. I will start with the consumer and I will get to government. We will do that. So let's start a little bit with the consumer. So as we see the consumer adopting technology, and I see them adopting with their food as well, because they want something better. They know that something's askew with, well, let's face it, who are we kidding? We're all adults. We've seen the factory farm footage. So I'm not even going to entertain the conversation that we don't know what's out there. Adults know. They know. So let's not pretend we don't know. You know what factory farming is all about. And most people disagree with that vehemently, actually. So now that they have a better choice, they didn't have the choice before, but now they really have a choice, particularly if you want a one-for-one replacement like cellular meat would be. You have that opportunity for yourself. So what the consumer needs now to help them make that purchase is some more information. And I think one of the things that could help cellular agriculture, but I'd love your opinion, is that a lot of this technology isn't new. First of all, technology in our food isn't new. It's, if you have seeds that can grow really quickly, et cetera, it's because you've technologically, done seed husbandry, if you will. You've grown seeds for certain parameters. So a lot of what we see in cellular agriculture isn't new. Like there's skin that's grown for burn victims, I read in your book. Is that right? To replace.
That's correct. That's correct. If we wanted to, we could grow human, and they are doing it, human tissues in the same way as, there is fundamentally not much difference between what we do for ourselves and what we do with animal cells. And so in a nutshell, what you do is you take a small sample, and hopefully that sample become perpetual, so the animal doesn't need to be returned to get another sample. But the animal isn't killed. It probably doesn't feel anything as a cow because it's so big, and only 2.5 milliliters, which is a tiny amount, it's about the size of my fingernail, is taken to produce the equivalent of 7 or 8 cows worth of meat in 40 days, 40 days, compared to growing that cow in intolerable and brutish conditions over a period of 28 months. Never seeing the sunlight until the day it gets taken to the slaughterhouse. It's, one day we'll look back at it and people say, well, it's traditional. Well, yes, it was traditional for, witches to be burnt. Doesn't mean it's right. There are not many traditions that are good traditions, really. And what we do to animals is very, very bad indeed.
I couldn't agree more. I actually think that our children and grandchildren, so certainly in our children's lifetimes, but for sure grandchildren, they will look back and they say, can you believe that they ate meat and they will be disgusted, and rightfully so. And I think there'll be some sort of shaming. Imagine you walked into an airplane with a lit cigarette. People would go crazy. They'd go nuts. Nobody would stand for it. Like the people in 1F and 1A would be duking it out. I mean, I think it's going to be that way for meat. You see someone order meat and people are going to look at that person and say, hey, you're junking up the planet. You're littering outside of your car. It's going to be like people who litter. This is what I think. And I think also, again, in our lifetimes, I just want to give one more example about how some of this technology already exists, and it exists for the betterment of us. So we used to take insulin from pigs, I think intestines. Oh gosh, I might have that wrong, but we took it from factory farmed pigs. But obviously factory farmed pigs, because of the conditions we put them in, there's fecal matter. There's just not a clean source. So instead, the pharmaceutical companies have decided to ferment these and they grow them in a lab. And so now we have insulin from pigs for diabetics grown in a lab because it is better for the recipients of the insulin. And that's what cellular agriculture is going to be, better for the consumer.
I completely agree. And, that's a reason to be very optimistic about the price of growth hormones coming down, because insulin is a hormone, and now it's produced at about $4 a gram in a recombinant process, which was developed in the 1970s in San Francisco. And so we, and you're right, it used to come from pigs' pancreases.
Pancreas, thank you.
And there were millions of pigs, and it's one of the reasons why Novo Nordisk is the biggest producer of insulin in the world, because it's situated in Denmark, and Denmark is one big factory farm producing pigs. Believe it or not, Denmark and Holland are massive, intensive farming locations. Holland is the second biggest food exporter in the world after the United States.
Yeah.
Now, I think a lot of this is going to be led by countries that don't produce food. So Middle Eastern countries import 95% of their food. Dubai, where I spend quite a lot of time in the United Arab Emirates, is very forward-thinking. And it's going to, I think, be one of the leaders in this. Singapore is another example where they don't produce any food at all. They want to produce food, and they can only do it because they don't have any land in using labs. Israel is another good example. They are world leaders in agri-tech and in cell agriculture because they are food insecure. So the United States produces more food than it needs and doesn't have that same pressure. The UK imports half of its food, and many of your listeners will be familiar with the fact that in the Second World War, we depended on convoys coming from the United States to feed the population. And a lot of those convoys were sunk by U-boat submarines. We were very, very close to starvation at one point. So if we could grow our own food, that would be a great thing. So there's all sorts of reasons and compelling reasons from a food security point of view to make this stuff close to the consumer. And that's what I can see myself doing this for the next 20 years. I know you'll be doing it for a lot longer, but it's we're on the cusp of an enormous wave here.
Yes, akin to the digital age and more. But you give me a great segue in that I see this as a political issue. I see food insecurity as a matter of national security if one wanted to draw political lines. And one might say, well, hey, we saw during COVID that the food supply was disrupted, and places like Singapore, which was dependent on imports and still is, became very susceptible, as did the Caribbean islands, et cetera. And you can start to see the political wheels turn, particularly if you have in trade talks with China and those aren't going well, either because they are poorly run by someone orange or whatever the reason may be. You start to see yourself and say, well, hey, I can't really negotiate well in trade talks if this person controls all my food. So you start to see countries draw the line in the sand. At least I would. So this brings me to the topic of government subsidizing research. and which governments are doing this well and which aren't. So I look at the lovely triangle that Israel has between universities and tapping into that brain power, government support, and industry, and how well they work together. And I look at how poorly the United States is doing here. You have some players, big idea ventures, but this is not government. This obviously is private, trying to work with universities. And you have measly drop in the bucket, $3.5 million kind of funding going to UC Davis, one of the first funds, I believe, for some research in this area. But I'm very surprised that the politicians aren't seeing their futures basically tied into how well you produce your own food. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, governments have got to get involved. And here in the UK, I think the government's beginning to do that. I talked to a company today out of Oxford, the University of Spinoff, a really interesting company, actually. And they're getting government support. And they're a pretty impressive bunch, actually. You mentioned Israel, there's also Singapore, the Middle East, I think will be a big area for this. That's right. And Hong Kong, possibly. China is active now in the field. Look, the fact that the US isn't subsidizing or isn't putting enough money towards this is probably a function of the strong lobbies in the agricultural sector. I mean, look what those lobbies have done. You know, the subsidy of corn syrup has directly contributed to obesity in the United States.
Yes.
There's no doubt about it. You know, it's as bad as tobacco.
Yeah.
And so those subsidies aren't good things. Hopefully the Biden administration will take note of that. And also, he's a big proponent of trying to stop or mitigating climate change. And, you know, what better way to do it than changing agriculture?
Yeah.
I know that carbon taxes are coming, partly because it's the right thing, partly because it's governments are very short of money after the pandemic, and it's an easy way of getting some money. And there is no reason why conventional food producers won't be taxed on their carbon emissions, which are very large. And then there's no reason why alternative protein companies aren't going to be the beneficiaries of carbon credits on the other side. So this is another area of business that we're looking at, but it's one that needs careful attention. But that will provide a very nice price umbrella for the alternative food producers to operate under if the conventional food producers are quite rightly, in my view, taxed. And the great thing is it's not a meat tax. It's not specific to a specific product. It is a tax on anyone who produces lots of carbon, which we need. We have to do it. I mean, otherwise we're going to boil to death, all of us.
Yeah, I love this because I find it a very efficient way of leveling the playing field and of also giving consumers more information. It's a very easy way for consumers to read right front of pack, like, ooh, this is, you know, something I want to support or don't want to support. And I'm hoping that in the end, this kind of shift, again, from the consumer will end up affecting subsidies, because a lot of the reason, at least in the plant-based world, less so for the Sellag, but in the plant-based world, you know, the meat and the meat grains to grow the grains are so heavily subsidized. It's very hard to get to price parity on the plant-based side when you've got this kind of unrealistic business scenario. You know, we here in the United States priding ourselves on capitalism and then really not having a fair business playing field is very strange to me.
Yeah, completely agree. There's no dispute on that. Let's do it. COP26, the biggest ever climate change convention. Now the United States is signatory to all this sort of stuff. It changes the game and the dial on everything. Let's make it happen.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In fact, so very fun. I'm speaking, you know, this is going to sound a bigger deal than it is, but, you know, the UN has like a gazillion different groups, right? So the UN Small Business leadership group has asked me to speak about sustainability and the connection to our food supply system. So I'm grateful that people are willing to receive the information. Just a short while back, people didn't want to hear it. They could talk about climate change, but they didn't want to hear that it had anything to do with their food. Now they're willing to hear that. And so I'm very grateful for that. Quickie question before we get to something like bugs. Are you investing in bioreactors, that kind of thing? I'm just curious.
We are not so much bioreactors, but in media and in growth hormones.
Oh, you are? Okay.
What I call the picks and shovels, so we're very interested in that area. I think it's a great area to look at.
Yeah, as this whole area grows, then upstream in the supply chain becomes more valuable, and there's more scale to be had, and so it's a great business decision. I'm sorry, before we get to bugs, I did have another question, and I want to be mindful of your time because I could talk to you for a very long time. I know it's late by you, so if you start to feel like this is going on too long, I'm so sorry. You're a wealth of knowledge. I'm
loving it, Elizabeth, but my
okay.
iPad will run out of battery in about 7 minutes. So just
okay, that's great. I will kind of wrap it up. No, this is good to know. One of the arguments against shifting the food supply might be, the farmers, what's going to happen to them? And I argue that it will be much better for them because right now they're basically indentured servants. I wondered if you had any comments on the job supply and how it could perform better under a new food supply system.
Yeah, a really important and good point. So in the developed world, about 1% of the population is engaged in agriculture. The most popular form of agriculture, as you well know, is selling crops to human beings for their own consumption, not selling crops to be put into animals.
Right.
Producing animals or dairy products is a precarious business. It's not particularly profitable. And so farmers, I'm not talking about the very, very big farmers, but the farmers that most people think of who are caring and compassionate people are much better off concentrating on crops grown for human consumption and embracing this revolution.
Yeah. Putting
the bioreactors on their land and understanding how things are changing in farming. But in terms of jobs, I honestly don't think there'll be much change because most of the jobs in food are in the marketing, the manufacturing, the distribution and so forth, and that won't change at all. And the actual number of people who are working on the farm, with the exclusion of the developing nations. And in terms of developing nations, I think we need to do something to help those farmers who are displaced. I don't know exactly what. I would imagine that's something that needs to be addressed. And maybe they can be recipients of carbon credits from the big food producers that are such polluters who should be taxed on their output. I don't know what the price of a packet of cigarettes is in the US, but here it's $22 or $23. And the number of smokers here has gone down dramatically, saving multiple lives. I think it's only about 10% of the population smokes in the UK now. It's going to get down to nothing, I'm sure of it. You rightly pointed out, Elizabeth, that why shouldn't it be the same thing with meat? So just tax them.
I love it from the businessman. Just tax them. I'll throw out a couple statistics here. So Light Life, which produces Tempe, it was bought by Maple Leaf, which is a Canadian meat company, but it falls under the Greenleaf umbrella of Light Life and Field Roast. Light Life has just built a 320,000 square foot plant-based processing plant in Indiana, and it is employing 460 people. You assume a household of 4. You're talking about almost 1,800 people are relying on a plant-based paycheck. Nothing makes you plant-based like a paycheck. So I think you're going to see a lot of these jobs that people were in processing plants with animals, and now they're making plant-based food, and their quality of life, in addition to that paycheck, is going to be so much better. We are short on time, so I'll just have to invite you back, and we can talk about bugs and how we both disagree that would be insanity.
I'll tell you about bugs right now. It's not a viable thing for the Northern Hemisphere because they require too much heat and energy to be made. Now, bugs are eaten widely in Southeast Asia, apparently 2 billion people on the planet eat bugs, but growing them for food in where we live just doesn't work. It's not a solution.
I will quickly add to that. We are currently still living in a pandemic. Are you kidding me that you have learned nothing from a pandemic, that you would now grow and farm bugs, which are much harder to contain than large animals, and the potential for, I mean, they still defecate like animals. I mean, just please, no.
Well,
Okay.
I'm with you. I don't know why you thought I was pro bug, but I'm absolutely not.
Okay. Well, so we stand together. We are not for bug farming. Absolutely.
In so many things, Elizabeth. Well, I mean, you use the phrase mission aligned. I think we totally are.
Yes, how lovely. And I will have you back because this has been a thrilling conversation for me. Thank you. I'm learning so much from you. 2 quickie exit questions. If you are having a bad day, it's not going the way you like, is there a phrase that you tell yourself to get yourself back in the game?
Every day is a good day.
Oh, I love it. Every day is a good day. And when you are super busy and you cannot get your hands on lunch, what is your go-to snack?
Well, today I didn't have any lunch because I was super busy. So I'm looking forward to my vegetable ratatouille and some plain naan bread tonight. So that's what I'm going to have.
We leave on vegetable ratatouille. Everyone watching on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn, so happy to have you here. I will see you all next week. You guys, I'm saying goodbye. Jim, don't go anywhere. Jim Mellon, thank you for all you do. I'm a fan. You stay put, everybody else. I will see